Thanks a lot, Professor Gereffi, for this extremely interesting presentation and for the work you have done. We still have some minutes for making questions before we break for coffee. So I will take first the question from there.
Thank you very much, Gary, for a really fascinating presentation. I just wanted to underline the importance of this type of work, and wanted to come at it from a slightly different angle, because I think that a lot what is happening at the moment in terms of policy innovation links actually to this value chain approach. And I give you a few examples of that. When the discussion that policymakers, national policymakers are facing in a globalized economy is, okay, if there's something going on in the value chain that we don't like in terms of, say, environmental standards or in terms of competitiveness, we only have national tools. So we might not like what is happening in the DRC, or we might not like what is happening in China, but what can we do? We're Germany, or we're the US. And I think increasingly what we see is that governments start using value chain approaches to do policy. So one of the most innovative pieces of policy over the last couple of years that has come out was slipped into the Wall Street Reform Act. It's a one-page and an 800-page document. And basically this one page simply said, if you are using a number of specific metals, you need to know and you need to audit this and you need to provide that information to the Securities and Exchange Commission where these metals come from, all the way down to the level of the mine. And the proof of burden is on you to show that environmental standards and human rights standards were followed there. So this so-called Dodd-Frank Act was a game changer, because suddenly companies at the top of the value chain were forced to either they had to put a label on it. If they couldn't figure it out, they had to put a label on it and say, okay, we're not conflict free. So this was the question about the kind of technology metals that come from the DRC and fuel conflicts there. And if they wanted to have a label that says we are conflict free, then they had to go back and trace this value chain. Now, this created huge pressure on the industry, to figure out how the value chain looked like. Because the Apples of this world had no idea. They had simply no idea where their stuff is coming from. They knew maybe one or two steps down the value chain, but they had no idea all the way to what was happening in DRC. And so suddenly you come into a situation where this was a game changer. Just the announcement of this law led to, within a week, to one of the largest Chinese manufacturers in that chain to switch their supply from the DRC to Brazil. Just a simple announcement that this policy would happen led to these quick switches, and had a huge amount of implications on the ground in the DRC and so on and so forth. Now, this approach basically of mapping value chains and picking out the bit of the value chain that is most amenable to policy making is something that we see increasingly. So we see that with furniture producers who, when European policymakers care about tropical timber and illegal logging, what they do nowadays is they go after the furniture makers and say, okay, you are the guys that need to guarantee to us that you're not using any illegal timber. And so then you get this trickle-down process through the value chain. And this approach, I think, is something that we will increasingly see in policymaking, because it's one of the very few tools that policymakers have in a globalized economy to change stuff like environmental standards, human rights standards, technology, also questions about competitiveness, about supply security issues. So when you had the discussion about rare earths and the scare around rare earths, if you want so, what we saw was, again, the same approach. Policymakers had no clue where this stuff is used in, where it's coming from, and how the value chain looked like. So over the last 2 or 3 years, what has happened is that policymakers have started to map out this value chain, and then to decide based on that, on what stage of the value chain to intervene and in what way. So I think this type of work, and if that can be supported through the statistics work of this community, if a policymaker could turn around tomorrow and say, okay, we have a specific concern about this particular industry, we think there is some dodgy stuff going on there, or there's some offshoring of industry that we don't like. Can you show us how this value chain looks like? Where are the critical nodes in this value chain? Where are the lead firms, and what is our where do we have access to that? If the statistics agency then could turn around and say, okay, this is how the value chain looks like, we have compiled that. Well, that would be a huge step forward. Thank you.
Okay. So now, Hubert, I think you wanted to comment.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I have a critique to do, but it's the same critique I do to all these kind of studies, and a question after that on the statistical thing. The critique is that I guess it's wrong. Sorry, Gary, but I mean everybody does that, to include the domestic part of the value chain when you speak about trade and value chain. It's true that Walmart capture, as you say, capture. I mean, I hate this word on top of that because it's not a zero-sum game. 80%. And when you buy a shirt at Walmart, I mean, but if I buy the same shirt at the shop, at the hotel, it will be twice the price. May I say that the hotel is even worse with the Pakistani workers because he captures 90% or 95% of the value? I guess it's wrong. So any study on international value chain has to stop at the factory price, in my opinion. But I mean, or at the supply chain. But it's really personal, and I know it's a lost battle. The question is, I see that you use a lot ISIC. Why don't you use HS? HS is renewed every 5 years, and people at the World Customs Organization are making a lot of effort to follow supply chain evolution and to adapt their classification. So perhaps it could be more interesting to use HS rather than ISIC. And you didn't show services. Services inputs look to be important. When we look at, for example, automotive industry in Mexico, and if I compare with Brazil, a lot of the additional costs in Brazil, which mean of loss of competitiveness in Brazil, comes from the higher price of services, domestic services, something like 30 or 35% more than Mexico. So perhaps services are also important. I have a question for Ronald, or UNSD. A lot of this data are based on Comtrade, and Comtrade is a huge source of information. I mean, it's really a public good. But there's something more than value in Comtrade, is unit value. Because Italy will compete with Bangladesh on shirts, but on different quality. And you can measure the difference in quality through unit value. So I mean, the work you may be doing on having better information on unit value, perhaps working in team with IMF, we developed method to calculate price indices. I mean, the difference between unit value and prices. It could be very interesting in the future. So as we will discuss future steps, it could be interesting. And here my iPad is over. So, but now the last question was for INEGI. In the presentation yesterday, Dr. Soho said that INEGI was lucky because it had both the geographical and the statistical dimension. And when I listened to Gary speaking about mapping the value chain, speaking about upgrading, I guess it would be very interesting for developing countries willing to do export promotion and attract FDI to link the data, the economic data with the territorial dimension, because really what we learned through Gary is that the territorial dimension is important. If you want to upgrade, you need to have access to labor, additional labor. And I don't know the name in English, I mean, but I remember that INEGI in the old time used to map the labor basin. I mean, what's the availability of labor by scale, etc., by municipality. This kind of information could be very important for business and for export promotion. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you have tackled different people actually, so let's maybe start with Professor Gereffi.
Quickly on this over your point, I mean, on the HS versus ISIC, I'll bring that back to Stacy. Ronald might also want to comment on it. I'm totally open to whichever is most useful. On service inputs, totally agree that those are critical, and in all these different sectors, things like R&D is going to be important, design, et cetera. So if we get measurement for those qualitatively, we understand that they're important. The question is how to put numbers on it, and that was part of the earlier discussion, but it's critical part of the value chain. Third, on the domestic part of the chain, I think the proposal that I'm trying to make here is clusters are part of any complex value chain. Clusters are place-based, so they are domestic, but clusters can have exports, they got imports, they're tied into the value chain in multiple ways. I think what we don't know, because we haven't looked at the link between clusters and from clusters to other countries that are part of the chain. So my proposal is, how can we design a methodology that more specifically characterizes each of the main clusters within neighboring countries to better understand this regional dynamic? And final point, back to the technology issue, various times I've tried to use unit prices, and we have used unit prices either to measure quality or to maybe even try to measure technology content, like in the, it's just that, as everybody here knows better than me, it's a hard thing to do, and often the quantity data just don't exist, or in an industry like medical devices, it's too dispersed. So I'd love to find a better way to operationalize quality and technology content, and help from this group would be welcome.
Thank you. Ronald?
Yes, thank you. Thanks to Gary for a very, very good presentation. Thanks for the questions. And so on the HS ISIC, I'm a big promoter of linking trade and business registers. And so that's where you would be able to see from the economic activity of the enterprises and link it back to their actual trade to get the HS there. So I would really like to go for the empirical kind of possibility if the, data, if that's possible. And that actually got me back to what Gary was saying during his presentation in the case of Costa Rica. So we did this in parallel, but your research was, of course, a little bit quicker than what we were trying to do on linking the HS to the business register. But I would maybe see also with the Costa Ricans if we can use this data that you have and see what it would be now that they made that link. So they would have the enterprises identified, and they would know what those enterprises have imported and exported. So that might be useful. And I think they're also, and our colleagues from Costa Rica can fill in on that, have now also added the FDI data to it, or they're trying to do that. So that also fills in then to see what the what that link is in that way. On Comtrade, yes, we've trade indices and unit value analysis is what we are is on our agenda. We actually having this a seminar in India in and Amativa is here, Amativa, that where one of the sessions will be on trade indices using unit value. Actually, unit values can be used for two purposes. One would be mainly checking the quality of your data, and one would be trying to calculate trade indices. And both of them we will have a look at. Now, HS at 6-digit level there's still baskets with a lot of different products in there. So the certain ones might be relatively homogeneous, but a lot of them are, there are different things in there. So that might not be useful for trade indices analysis. We really will encourage countries to do this at the national level, at very detailed product level. We like them to use customs data to do this, but it has to be very detailed. And we are encouraging this also definitely in when we do our seminars for capacity building in developing countries, that they link their trade system to immediately calculate also trade indices. And it helps for analyzing quality. That's my point.
Thank you. Now I will give the floor to Inegi.
Thank you, Gary, for this very interesting presentation. And let me bring to the floor a reflection in the perspective of the National Statistical Office as provider of statistics for the calculation of GVCs and the identification of GVCs. In this case, we have in the mind the issue of the tracking that we need to do to the GVC, but the statistics that we have obviously is under the confidentiality restrictions. So with this point of view, we would like to know, in this case, Gary, how are you solving the confidentiality restrictions in order to advance in the analysis of GVCs? And with this point of view, in fact, this is another reflection. What would be the scope of the national statistical offices in order to advance in the analysis of GVCs? Why this question? Because in INEGI, for example, the presentation of Francisco Guillén and I would be in the issue of the advances that INEGI has now in the perspective of the contribution to produce statistics with this point of view. The trade, with the linking with the economic surveys, in this case with the manufacturing activity, we're focused now in this, initially in this industry, the manufacturing, and the calculation of the value added, in this case associated to the global manufacturing industry. So the issue is, and I would like to raise, because there are representatives of many national statistical offices, central banks, responsible of the statistics in their countries. So the question is, what will be the scope of the national statistical offices in order to provide information, to make works, in order to contribute to analysis of GVCs, to contribute to analysis with OECD to trade in value added, to contribute to analysis, in this case, of the globalization, the new configuration of the world economy in this case. So I think that is important, because now INEGI is advancing in this perspective, but in fact, we don't know if, in fact, we are thinking if INEGI would be responsible of all these kind of calculations, for example, no? Why? Because the Ministry of Economy now is interested with the Center of Globalization, that Gary Gereffi is the leader. So the idea is to promote, obviously, these kind of studies, but what would be the scope, in this case, of INEGI? And now INEGI, as best practice, house a data analysis laboratory in order to give access to the users to microdata. But obviously, behind, we have the restriction of the confidentiality. So it's important to take into account this view, I think, in order to promote the ideas, the work that we need to undertake in the national statistical offices, and obviously to promote the investigation, the research that we need in order to advance in the analysis of GVCs. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
Sorry, on the other hand, according with your question, Hubert, well, the main idea to use the geographical information inside and to have together with the statistical economic data means that we could cross this information on the territorial or some specific local points. In this view, we have different instruments. One is the census that we could put as a cape on the territorial. The other hand, one is the directory of economic units, that is another point of view and give us some labor data that we could put on the maps, geographical maps, and that gives us another idea. Of course, looking for confidentiality, in some cases we have to be careful. So, on the other hand, we have the opportunity to cross different ideas about, for instance, to have studies like clusters or something like that in a geographical view. Again, we have to be careful with the confidentiality, as Gerardo said before. And on the other hand, well, this is an advantage to look in regional view. If I cross this information with other, like, for example, the gross domestic product by entity that we did every year, and of course with the main sectors, we have the opportunity to look more inside of our country what happened. On the other hand, of course, we have to look the gross value chains outside, but at the same time, I think that Gereffi proposal is very important to look which other industries around our clusters is in relation with other states to United States, for example, because we have another relation with Europe and other countries, but this is the idea, to have a very good information to put and to look what happened with this important point. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will give the floor now to Professor Gereffi.
I think the INEGI comments are extremely helpful, and the confidentiality issue is critical because that's the key, a key value added of GVC work is firm level data and how we integrate it into the overall analysis. I would divide the confidentiality question into two types of firms. One type of firm are the lead firms, those big companies in which confidentiality really isn't so critical, in the sense that everybody knows where the Nissan, where all these plants are from Bombardier, Nissan, et cetera, and there's quite a bit of secondary information about the characteristics of those clusters. So I think one part of the firm level analysis can proceed through secondary research almost. We don't need the INEGI data per se, on the, although whatever they would have on lead firms would be useful. And when we do the study in Costa Rica, and I showed those firms, the Ministry of Trade encouraged all of them to participate in the study and to interview with us. And so by classifying them in terms of when they entered, we're not really, we made sure not to say anything confidential about any individual company. We're using that information more to show historical flow of FDI. So even when we have permission, we still, as any good researcher, have to avoid saying anything about a particular company that's not published. Where I think the INEGI data is absolutely critical is on the suppliers and the characteristics of those clusters that we might be working on. And I think it's not difficult to design the work where we would have, somebody would have access to the microdata, but we could create categories, types of suppliers, where the data are aggregated up to a point where we're not releasing information about individual companies. But what I think we do need to do is we need to somehow be able to compare different clusters in an industry, and there's where the INEGI data is likely to be much more comprehensive, but create the data categories that are general enough that no individual firm feels like we're saying anything that would violate your responsibility in terms of protecting that data. So I think that's, and I'm sure that's kind of a joint problem-solving effort. We need to think together the right kinds of categories that tell us enough about how the chain works, but don't reveal confidentiality. And I definitely think it's a solvable problem.
Thank you. So I have two more interventions before the coffee break. So I will start with Frédéric from France and then Ivo from the UNSD.
Thank you for this stimulating presentation. I got 2 points. The first is about the articulation between product and firms. I didn't well understood. And behind the question of articulation between product and firms, there is the question of value. Because, as I said, I think already, I think that there is a very important difference and confusion between value chain and activity chain. And here, there is more a description of activity chain. Behind, there is the idea of value. But, so, about product and enterprises, the more obvious could be management, which is a common activity or support function for different products in the firm, but also services, about with Hubert said a different thing, are common for different products. So I didn't understand how you solve it, because there is a question of the imputation of one common service to different product, or if we see the chain, if you take R&D, the imputation of R&D cost to different point of the chain. The second question is what you show about Costa Rica and Mexico. If I well understood, but maybe I missed different points, there is some kind of, we say in French, remontée dans la chaîne de valeur, better insertion, higher insertion in the value chain. Upgrade. Yes, of course. In the value chain. Okay? But it seems to me that you speak about the value of the product, even unit value of the product, but the value added available in Costa Rica or Mexico, maybe you capture it only with the wage, I don't know, but at the end there is the question of the income, which is the question of national accounts. But how much income at the end rests in the country, even if there is that upgrading? Thank you.
Thank you.
Very challenging, good questions. Let me just focus on the activity chain versus the value chain. When we do, I'll take our North Carolina and the global economy, like the furniture chain, and we put NAICS codes in all of those value chain boxes, we can then use those NAICS codes. We typically go to a firm level survey like Dun & Bradstreet. So Dun & Bradstreet tells us all the establishments that are in North Carolina. At the establishment level, every establishment has to put 6 NAICS codes for their activities. We assume the first is the most important, et cetera. It's imperfect because we know they're doing multiple things. So what we typically do is we'll take the first NAICS code and say, that's what the firm does. So it allows us to say, in how many boxes of the furniture chain does firm X participate? So in that way, we can empirically overlay the firm's participation in the chain using their information on NAICS codes. The problem when we go internationally is what's the equivalent? I mean, first in the US, how valid is Dun & Bradstreet data? I mean, there's 4 or 5 survey organizations, but it's the one thing we have. And because it's at the establishment level, we can then aggregate up to establishments that are part of a bigger firm, et cetera. Internationally, how do we do that? I'm not sure. We'd have to, but this is, I think, where the business registry or some other firm level information would have to come in, where the value chain can tell us, that activity chain, which product codes are there. We need a separate list of companies that also have product codes linked to what they do, like Dun & Bradstreet gives us, to be able to add to companies. The bigger question of values and value added is that's the hardest question in the value chain stuff, because when we start with existing data like how many employees, average wages, we can get that from Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US. If we're also interested in gender or other or at skill levels, we can also add that. So we can start layering in different kinds of qualitative information across the chain that tells us some important things. But I agree that if we really wanted to know profits or value added, we can't get it from those existing data. The fact that the iPhone study has been cited so much, people often don't make explicit that only in electronics do you have those tear-down sheets that have allowed those authors to estimate the value added of Apple and all those other suppliers in that value chain. And that's making assumptions about those authors never were able to interview Apple. The other authors who did the Nokia phone study that Uber is the Brad Pitt of the WTO website with his little video, never interviewed Nokia. So the problem is lead firms don't provide access. So that we absolutely need to find reliable data sources that help us on that value added question, because we can't get it directly other than what we learn from firm interviews, and those aren't easily reproducible.
I know. It's just a 1-second remark from official statistics. So I've been looking a lot at the GVC mapping because I like what Gary's doing, and I really try to understand, well, how does this fit in our official statistics brain? And the way I look at it is as follows. It's the GVC map is a high-level product basket. So this could be 3-digit CPC. Then what's inside of these GVC maps are firms. So this is ISIC, activity-based. And then if you have data, if you have trade by enterprise data to match against it, then you can fill it up.
Okay, now final question from Ivo.
Did Hubert switch it off again?
It's good with switching. Not working.
No, it's okay.
It's working, yeah. And this is not a question, it's basically an observation. I think, Gary, you made in your presentation reference to it. And I think that opportunity now to actually start experimentation and testing of some of these GVCs into official statistics, I think with a project that you just indicated, or a program between Mexico, US and Canada, really following that, what you say, the regional clustering that takes place between the three countries, but also within the country itself, would be a great opportunity if the National Statistical Institute will be really involved. I think you would like to get them involved, but it will also give us a lot of potential to actually test a lot about the use of the supply and use tables, including for instance, using the provincial supply and use table in Canada, which is one of the best ones now in the world, and they use it for taxation purposes. We could see to what extent we can also extend it to the US and Mexico that also have these kind of tables. There's a lot of things to be done around classifications, but we talk about around business functions and bring that into the chain. So it gives us a lot of opportunity looking at that project as a proposal to actually bring into the overall program of work that we have, and maybe also replicate that later in other regions around Asia, maybe Africa, that really helps us to actually make good progress, and not only on the conceptual side, but really on the back practices. So I think we should seriously consider that. I know you're looking at that also at us. I think you made that explicit reference, where do the participants sit. I think it is very interesting for us, and I think we should actively explore this program in collaboration. And I thank you for your offer that you will be willing to look at it favorably when you develop that project with the Interim Combine.
Thank you. Very briefly, please.
Quick, sorry, I know it's short. Just a very quick question, Terry. I'm very interested in your presentations, but your title is Combine the GVC and IO analysis. But it seems I didn't catch the major part of your title. What my comments are suggesting here is you say a lot of things missing. For example, I just go to the textile value chain. You have a lot of input data. You saw that is missing. Then you have output data is missing. I make a suggestion. You say, I think fourth order, you can use the IO table. You say, for example, the textile have an output, but this output will go through the IO structure, go to different industries. Also have an input structure that can go different industries. You say, for classification for 35 sectors, seems to aggregate. However, if you're thinking wide, they have 41 countries. 41 plus 35 is 1,435 sectors. The key is assumptions, because different country in the same industry classification, but the products are different. For example, the products from China automobile industry might be very different with the products from Germany, because that's different portion of the automobile value chain. Then you have a lot of disaggregations. So that's why you say we read a paper for the CO2 emission with global value chain. We using each of these as a production stage. So we locate what is the much more carbon stage of the production. So I think that kind of assumption can be used, then applied using existing data to enrich that's really can combine your GVC and IO analysis. That's just one comment.
Okay, thank you. The very last one now, the very last one from there.
Yeah, Professor Gereffi, you made a statement which I think is very relevant for what we've been doing here. You said that global value chains are different than TIVA. What exactly do you mean by that? Because what we've been talking about is how TIVA represents global value chains?
I think when people have used increasingly this concept of participation in global value chains in OECD, WTO, UNCTAD, and other places, they've been referring to that as intermediate goods trade. I think, for me, TIVA helps measure the kind of participation that countries have in global value chains. So I see them as complementary. Value chains as a concept. TIVA is a way to measure participation at country level, industry level, et cetera. So I don't see them as different. I see one as concept, one as measurement.
Okay, thanks a lot. So we have had a very lively session at this point. So now we are going to break for coffee, but before I've been told that Inegi